Okay, chapter 4 of Johnson's book brings us straight into the 1850s and the American Civil War. And he makes a number of kind of key points here and brings in some new players, most importantly, German Americans, German immigrants, largely after the 1848 revolutions in Europe. But basically, the 1850s and the Civil War sees an imperialist white supremacy kind of prevailing in the city. And starts with the rise of the Republican Party in the 1850s, led by John Fremont, who has strong St. Louis connections. And this Republican Party sees, according to Johnson, wants free labor, free land, free men, and what they largely mean by that is white men. And they kind of fit into that either force free African Americans out or keep them kind of on the east. And on page 125, I think Johnson gives his kind of best summation of how he understands the rise of the Republicans. And he says, just as the political philosophy of the more conservative of the Republicans drew on images of Native American dispossession and disappearance to frame their predictions about the Western apotheosis of the white man, the military careers of the radical Republicans emerged out of the crucible of empire and Indian killing. So basically, the logics and the work of against Native Americans then gets mapped onto interacting with African Americans and creates this notion of a kind of white person's West. Now, into this mix comes a large number of St. Louis residents and Missourians in general who supported the Republican Party, and those are Germans and German immigrants. And there's lots of reasons German immigrants supported the Republicans. The Republicans were less nativistic than others, nativism being like kind of anti-immigrant. But also the emphasis on freedom was pretty important to a lot of these German immigrants. They had battled against European aristocracies in 1848. Some of them had read socialist works and communist works like that by Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, published in 1848. And they brought with them a kind of sense of solidarity of workers, that people who labored could have something in common, regardless of their race. And so these German Americans who are going to support the Republican Party have a slightly different approach to how things can be in the city and in the country. Now, when the Civil War hits, we see, on one hand, St. Louis is kind of, it's a divided city. It's divided between, pro-Democrat, pro-secessionist, pro-Southern sympathizers versus Unionists, Republicans, anti-slavery folks. But the war, also we see John Fremont push for overall emancipation, overall abolition, which seems to run against Johnson's point about this kind of white supremacist imperialism. Fremont seems much more complicated than that. But what happens to the city is that we see newcomers, and these are largely people who either are coming for freedom or because they've been displaced by war. And we see these newcomers interacting with locals, interacting with these German immigrants. And I think Johnson puts it really beautifully at the end of the chapter, where he says, on the streets of St. Louis, as both black and white migrants crowded into the city, the question of freedom remained an open and contested one. And indeed, at the end of the period of Reconstruction, radicals in St. Louis would once again provide the nation with an example of Midwest-style communist revolution. And so what we have here is kind of end of the Civil War. There's a setup for kind of radical change, that there's the possibility of interracial community and interaction. There's the possibility of labor and leftist politics and economics. And so the end of the Civil War kind of has a moment of opportunity, which we're going to see what then kind of happens moving forward.